We do need to put this disclaimer up that the content, opinions, and views are of the authors and don't necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. So here we are. This is a webinar that is actually part one of a four-part series, and we recognize that implicit bias is very much a topic on many people's minds, and so we wanted to spend time kind of digging deeper into it. And so we are going to start first with the individual. We do a lot of training around cultural and linguistic competence, and that is always one of our points of instruction, is that you always need to start with yourself. And so we welcome you to this session and glad that you are willing to consider and think about, like, how does it show up in us as individuals. So this is your presenter group. Again, my name is Rochelle Espiritu. I am based in Denver, Colorado, and I am a first-generation Filipina and have been living in the States for quite a while, pretty much since I was a toddler. And I have been very passionate about working in communities of color for pretty much my entire professional career. My background is in clinical psychology, and I helped to form a small women-owned, minority-owned business called Change Matrix, and we serve as partners on the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Transfer Technology Center. So I will let Caitlin introduce herself to you now.
Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Farrick, and I'm a knowledge transfer specialist for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, as well as a change specialist with Change Matrix. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin. I saw there was at least one Wisconsin person, so hello from the cheese state. My background is in law and early childhood education. I recently joined the team, and I previously worked at the Michigan Department of Education, where I focused on early childhood systems coordination and collaboration. So, as Rochelle mentioned, and I mentioned as well, we're with the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC. So what exactly is the Pacific Southwest MHTTC? It's part of SAMHSA's new network that provides training and capacity building to our nation in a regional approach. So the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center serves the mental health workforce in Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, and the Pacific Islands, which include American Samoa, Guam, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Northern Mariana Islands, and Palau. And our role, as you'll see here, we offer a collaborative MHTTC model in order to provide training, technical assistance, and resource dissemination that supports the mental health workforce to adopt and effectively implement evidence-based practices across the mental health continuum of care. And our goal is really to promote evidence-based, culturally appropriate mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery strategies that providers and practitioners can start, strengthen, and sustain them effectively. And these are a listing of our services, and I want to stress that our services are free services. So if you're interested in any of these things, these are definitely something that we hope to connect you to. And of course, like you, I know many of you during this time, we're doing some pivots to how we deliver our services, and in person is really not an option at the moment.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I just wanted to go over our agenda for today. So we're doing welcome and introductions right now. We will be talking a little bit about what is implicit bias, so getting us grounded in a common definition and some characteristics of it. We will also explore some strategies to confront and challenge implicit bias, and also look at how implicit bias shows up in our behaviors. We do encourage you to put in your questions and your feedback along the way. We don't have kind of a formal Q&A session at the end of the hour, but what we did do, because we know that we often run out of time on these opportunities, is we added an additional 30 minutes to the end of this webinar, so we'll be going for 90 minutes total. We also know that when we were promoting this, initially it was only for an hour, so we understand if you can't stay or if you have other, something else at the end, but we did want to offer the opportunity to stay on for an additional half hour in case you have deeper questions that you want to dive into with us as a panelist as well. So with that, we do want to get to know you. So feel free to continue to put in where you're coming from. If you want to put in a little bit about your role, that also helps us because maybe we can provide some additional examples or stories from the different areas. As Caitlin mentioned, though, we are focused on the Pacific Southwest. So that is kind of where we tend to focus and offer examples for as well. And if there's something that you really want to learn from this session, please let us know that too, because we can try to include that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I see a couple participants indicated they're wondering about the role implicit bias might play in crisis response, effective ways to address implicit bias. So those are a couple thoughts.
Yeah, great. And I realized earlier I didn't actually provide the framework for the 4-part series, so let me do that really quickly right now. I mentioned that this one is really focused on the individual. Our second session is going to be focused on how implicit bias shows up in terms of our client-provider relationship. The third one is going to look at organizational culture and climate, because we know that implicit bias seeps into the way we create policies or practices. So we want to explore that a little bit more deeply in terms of how that shows up in organizations and agencies. And then the last one will be on how implicit bias can show up in terms of our engagement with community. And so that's kind of the 4-part series. It's going to be 1 per month moving on forward. And I think we have a slide at the end that will show you some of the dates for those sessions.
Yeah, we do. Great. So why talk about implicit bias? We're going to kick off the content portion of this session with a video. And we think this video is a powerful video that highlights our differences and similarities. So the way this is going to work,
I think we have over half of you done, and if you're not, my apologies. I hope that maybe you'll go back to it later, because there's definitely some funny parts to it. And so if you were not able to watch the video, essentially it is an opportunity for folks to consider thinking about outside of the boxes that we tend to place people in. And so it is a group of people who have come from various backgrounds, perspectives, experiences, looks, and the narrator asks people to step in and out of the center of the room if they agree with a particular statement. So something first like, how many of you are a step-parent? How many of you are in love? How many of you have seen a UFO or believe in outer space in that way? And it's just a very touching video, and I think what it does is at the end it makes us recognize that we can't judge or think by appearances, but that we share very many commonalities. And so thank you for sharing your comments on it. I see one person saying that the video gets me every time, and for as many times that I've shown this video as well, I still tear up every time I watch it and get a good laugh as well. So I hope that you use this too and share it with other people as well, because it's a great video. All right, so we will move on. Joanne, you can probably put down everyone's hands, is my guess at this point, but thank you for indicating that to us.
So on this slide, you'll see some demographic trends and changes for the United States. And these trends show that demographics are changing around our country, as well as in the communities that we serve. And so what people typically thought of as the majority population in the United States, or who lives in their communities, or the people who need services, are changing over time. And so that's why it's really important to acknowledge both our conscious and our unconscious biases when working with people or groups in our communities. So now we want to set create some common ground. So using the chat box, which a number of you have been using, what is one word that most resonates with you when you hear implicit bias? It can be any word, just whatever comes to your mind.
And if you can type into the chat, that'd be great. We're seeing quite a few around, and now it's going super fast. Ignorance, preference, privilege, assumptions, hate, racism.
A lot of unconscious or unknowing. is a theme.
Mhm.
Assumptions. Judgment. Someone wrote survival. One moment.
Great.
Systemic. Great. So a lot of terms, some that are sort of neutral, some with maybe more of a negative connotation or a positive connotation. Environment, privilege.
Great. Well, we will move on. I know that in our last webinar that Leora did, some people were asking for the history of the chat too. So I think Joanne was able to do it for that webinar. So I'm hoping that maybe we could share this with you as well as a follow-up. So we'll move on. Before we actually get into a definition of implicit bias, what we wanted to do was just talk a little bit about brain science before we go into that, because it's so related, right? So our brains, our human brains, are so wired to take in a ton of information. We have so much that we have to process every day and every minute of the day, that what we know is that we couldn't do that, take every piece of information in all the time and process that. And so what we know we need to do is we have to have these mental shortcuts that our brain can take. And so oftentimes our brains are taking the simplest path to a conclusion in order to help us kind of just like functionally deal with all of that information that we're getting. Leora's brain pictures were much more elaborate last time. This is a very simple one that we wanted to break down into you. So there's been a lot of brain research done, and there's some research that helps us kind of understand bias and why they're useful. And so if you think about the brain having two systems, there's a system one that is this kind of really unconscious, really fast, this effortless, you don't need to think about function of our system of our brain. So that is kind of something like, we all know the answer to 2 + 2 because we've been learning that so often we don't need to think about that. We know how to cross the street. We just kind of look to the left and the right, but we learned that along the way, and now it's very unconscious and we just do it as fast, we don't think about it. So those are kind of those system one kind of thinking. It's not necessarily it's without awareness really. And then we've got the system two part of our brain that is a lot more conscious, very deliberate, it's slow and effortful. And so one of the examples I like to use in addition to the math one is it's kind of like me trying to help my senior with his AP math class where I am told that I am very old school, like I don't know how to do the stuff my son does now. But it requires a lot more thought, it's a lot of effort to do. And so where biases sit really is in that system one part of our brain and the way it processes information. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you what I think should be a system one question. So shouldn't have to think about this very long, but type it into the chat box. How many of each animal did Moses bring onto the ark? Just throw your answer in really fast in there. And for some of you, sorry, this is like a biblical reference. So I've done this before, not everyone knows, but it was the one that I could think of that would help us with this. So I see a lot of folks putting in answers, but I see a couple coming in now, and you caught me, right? So quickly we will say 2, but I will say, well, Moses really was the guy that was burning a bush on the mountain, and Noah was the one who had the ark. But that's kind of an example of how our brains work. Like we just listen to the question and it's like, oh yeah, ark, animals, I know the answer to that. And we think it's pretty effortless. But we have to kind of pause. And this is that example of we need to sometimes slow down and be a little more deliberate. but it gets a lot of people a lot of times, so don't feel bad. So let's go on to then now thinking about what implicit bias is. And let me give you a little history back onto it. It's definitely a term that I think so many of us have heard now. And it's something that's been around a bit for a while. And so you'll see on this slide that a couple of researchers hypothesized that our social behavior is actually not entirely under our control. And so they offered this idea of unconscious bias or hidden bias or implicit bias that suggests that a lot of our social behavior is driven by our learned stereotypes that are automatic and therefore unconscious in the way that we interact with people. And I'd say it was probably just a couple of years ago where the term implicit bias was kind of really lifted up, when it might have been President Obama at the time who kind of talked about, like, is Jerome more hireable than a Jim? Right, where we were looking at studies and things that were happening in the criminal justice system that kind of lifted up these unconscious biases that were showing up in systems, particularly in law at the time. And so let me offer to you this definition. So implicit biases are those attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and our actions and our decisions in an unconscious way. So that's what a lot of you put that into the chat, that it is unconscious. They are involuntary. So again, it's that without awareness, without our control, it's just this automatic experience that we might have. We want to really lift up that they can be either positive or negative. I think that what's happened more recently is that implicit bias is getting this kind of negative attention, but what we'll talk about is that biases help us also, right? So they can be negative or positive, and that everyone has them. No one does not have them. They are with everyone. And so some of the characteristics of it are that implicit biases are everywhere, right? They are robust because our brain needs them to function. There is a distinction, though, between them being implicit or explicit, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing that is important to note is that implicit associations don't always align with how we think about ourselves, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about the implicit association test, but we will note that oftentimes our biases don't reflect what our real values are. We tend to have implicit biases that favor our own group, and we'll see that as well later. And they also have a real effect on how we behave, and we'll talk about some of those concepts later. The good news is that implicit biases are malleable, so they're not necessarily things that are set in stone, that we have options as individuals. We can move our brain thinking into systems too and slow ourselves down when we notice them and are aware of them. All right, so let's see. Let's just go really quickly a little bit into some of these distinctions, because I know sometimes we talk about these terms interchangeably, but just want to make sure that we're clear on how they are different. So we've got two pictures up here, mango and a papaya. So a preference might be that I've had both a mango and a papaya, and based on my knowledge and based on data that I've eaten them before, I might have a preference for mangoes, but it's based on information that I have collected. And in fact, I did have a mango earlier today because they're in season, which is really good. Now with a bias, I might have had a bias towards one or the other, but not based on any information. I might have just said, hey, I really like mangoes, but I don't know why, I just do. Now, an unconscious or implicit bias would be something where I think I like mangoes more than I like papayas, but actually I tend to choose papayas more than mangoes. So there's like a disconnect there in terms of where my bias is lying. So when you think about that, that can extend. I mean, I chose fairly neutral objects so that there would not be an emotion tied to them, but then you can now change that up for maybe I have a bias towards a specific group or a particular characteristic of people, and that's where you see where you have the preferences, the biases, unconscious or explicit. But we do have options, as Leora is reminding us. All right, so pass it back over to Caitlin.
Now we're going to talk about the implicit association test. And this is a test that was developed by Harvard University in partnership with other institutions such as the University of Virginia and the University of Washington. And some of you who registered for this webinar may have seen that we asked if it was all possible for you to take one of these tests. I'm wondering if you could write in the chat box if you were able to take the implicit association test before our session, or if you've ever taken one before.
And if you did, we'd love to know which test you took, and maybe what your response was to it.
Yeah, so if you haven't taken one in a few years, there's many more than there were in the past. I think probably the most popular one is based on race, but there's some for age, weight, and other categories as well. So the IAT is a computerized, if you weren't able to take it or you want a little more background, it's a computerized timed dual categorization task that measures implicit preferences by bypassing conscious processing. Like I said, it's a collaborative effort with Harvard, UVA, and the University of Washington, and examine thoughts and feelings that exist either outside of our conscious awareness or within our conscious control. And it looks like a number of people took them, including one on presidents, which is a newer one as well. You can see here more than 20 million people have taken the IAT since 1998 when they released it, their age. And some people indicated that they have, in the chat, they have stronger biases than they thought. More recently, someone said they indicated they took the weight one and they had a strong implicit preference for thinner people. And so that was something that was interesting to them. So data strongly suggests that many people hold implicit biases towards members of particular groups. For example, 80% of the participants, people who took the age IAT, had a bias against the elderly. So I think sometimes it's interesting to see how the IAT plays out as far as what you think your beliefs might be as opposed to what the test shows. And again, there are flaws with this test, but it is an interesting tool to get a conversation started around biases and begin to explore some of our attitudes. So if you did take the IAT, which again, it looks like some of you took many of them, we saw that, what test did you take? What was your immediate reaction to your results? And do you think these results represented who you think you are?
And I did, Caitlin, see some folks acknowledge that, I had a bias for age and I'm an older adult, and I think, other ones too, where there was maybe a bit of a surprise in terms of the results. And just want to pull up again that I think we all kind of get surprised by them a little bit. For some of them, I know I was as well. And our biases don't necessarily align with our values. and that's the point of it being a bias, that it is unconscious and it doesn't necessarily kind of resonate with who we think we are also. Again, if you can put that into the chat box, that would be great. And if we can reserve the Q&A box for questions, just so we can monitor it a little bit easier, that would be helpful for Leora as well.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks, Saganya, for pointing out awareness is the first stage to being culturally responsive. And that's part of the reason why we like this test, is because it can kind of show us a little bit about maybe what our responses are.
And I think show that implicit bias doesn't have to always be, again, towards someone in a different group than yourself. You can feel bias even within a group that you are part of, when it related to age, for example.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks for sharing. I think it's always interesting. They're kind of a little bit like a rabbit hole. I feel like sometimes I just start taking a couple and I'm like, oh, an hour later I've taken a whole bunch of them. So thanks for sharing your experience with that. Remember too that biases, again, as we talked about earlier, and I'm kind of pulling up on Leora's comment, is that biases can be positive or negative. There's no, we cannot put a value on that. I think what's important is that it's recognizing when we have them and what we decide to do about it. So we're going to get into this next a little bit in terms of how it can show up in terms of our actions. So we're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions, and you can see here on the slide, so I didn't catch this, the font was a little light here, but they are very small acts that have an incredible impact. So I want you to kind of imagine maybe a couple instances where maybe you might have experienced microaggression or actually did it yourself. So imagine maybe a time with, I'll give a couple examples. An Asian American student is sitting in his or her professor's office, and maybe they have a meeting and the professor says at the end of the meeting, your English was really good, despite maybe that student actually being born in the USA. Maybe think about the times when you about maybe a black man walking down the street and noticing that a white woman coming along the other side might clutch her purse and maybe walk to the other side of the road. Or maybe imagine a time when a woman is in a meeting with all men and can barely get a word in, and that the meeting is fully dominated by the male voices in the room. So there's a name for those kinds of situations and what's happening. It's essentially when a bias shows up in our behaviors that leaves people feeling uncomfortable or insulted. Those are microaggressions. So we wanted to share this slide here. Microaggressions are the kinds of remarks, the questions, the actions that are painful because they have to do with a person's membership in a group that's discriminated against or subject to some kind of stereotype. And a key part of what makes them so disconcerting is that they happen really casually and frequently, oftentimes without any harm intended, and they happen in everyday life. And so psychologist Gerald Sue was actually the first person who kind of coined it and defined the term as those everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBTQ populations, or those who are marginalized experiences in their day-to-day interactions with people. And so here you'll see a little bit more. The University of Utah actually put together this nice poster that outlines some of the things that people say and hear in their everyday life. And I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat and appreciate your openness and vulnerability in terms of sharing. You know, things like, you know, you speak really clearly. I'm trying to look really carefully because I keep on saying I'm going to increase these font sizes and I can't. I don't know if you can help me read them, Caitlin, but for some reason I can't read them on here.
One is like you're a really good athlete for a girl, I believe. One is you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of them is like, what are you? And I remember experiencing that when I think I mentioned I'm based in Denver, but when I first came to Boulder for grad school, I was coming from California, Stockton, California, a really diverse city, and came to Boulder. And the first question somebody asked me that I met when I got there was like, what are you? You know, like really just ask like that. And I was so taken aback. I was like, well, I'm a student that's visiting the campus. I was so shocked. I didn't know how to respond. And now that I've had more training and understanding, I'm like more prepared. But, you know, I have gotten that question a lot. I think a lot of people have as well. But if you want to share, you know, are there other things or questions that are asked that you've seen or behaviors, feel free to share those in the chat. Okay, so let's go on to this section.
So since implicit bias lives in our subconscious, it can be hard to spot. So we're going to use this moment to reflect honestly on our own thoughts and behaviors. And this is a question for self-reflection. So You do not need to type in the chat if you don't want to. It's for your own personal learning. But again, if you do wish to, please feel free to type in the chat box. Have you ever avoided sitting next to someone in public based on how you perceive their race, their religion, or their ability? And give people a moment to reflect.
I'm just going to move this on because we asked you for time.
Yeah. So as you can see, sometimes we make assumptions about people based on the way they look. Our assumptions may impact if we feel safe or comfortable sitting next to somebody, even though we have no idea whether our assumptions are true. The next time you find yourself looking for a seat, considering sitting next to someone who looks different than you. If you feel comfortable and the situation is appropriate, strike up a conversation. You might realize you have more in common than you think. And one of the resources we use for this reflection question is lovehasnolabels.com, and it has this question as well as other prompts if this is some sort of work you want to do personally or with your organization.
Yeah, thank you. So we do want to share a second video with you. Hopefully you got it down with the first one here. And so somebody, Joanne, if you don't mind copying and pasting the link into there. This video is actually called, I'll give you the label, the name in case you need to do a Google search for it, but it's an anti-racist short film called Jafar, but it's spelled T-Z-A-F-A-R. So we will ask you to go to that video and watch that as well, and we will be silent so you can listen to that video. It's a short one, less than 2 minutes.
It's from a different country, I think Greece potentially. I'm not exactly sure, but there is a couple with their young daughter sitting in what looks like a hospital waiting area, and a young man is sitting near them. He is dark-skinned, and the couple and their daughter are lighter-skinned. They try to move their daughter further away from this person. Then when the doctor calls them in to his office, he also has the young man come in with them, and at that point, he tells them that this was the person who was the bone marrow donor for their daughter. And so they kind of look shocked and surprised. So it just really illustrates that, you don't really know someone just based on your assumptions. And it is a really powerful video. Most people I know who've seen it really enjoy it. So the link, it will be on the slide of the PowerPoint, which will be provided to you.
Yeah,
a lot of people
are making more people cry on this webinar. Sorry about that, but I mean, it is one of those really heart-tugging kind of movies that also makes you just recognize how often this also happens in our society and what we need to do to change it. All right, so we will move on to our next slide.
So implicit bias impacts every sector. As you can see here, the focus of a lot of our work is mental health or behavioral health related, but certainly implicit bias shows up in every sector. Examples being law enforcement, the criminal justice system. And we know that implicit bias are pervasive and it'll show up in all aspects. And these biases, whether they're implicit or they're more explicit biases, can lead to structural racism. And structural racism is defined as the ways in which society fosters or builds racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems like housing, education, employment, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. So I'm wondering, how do you see implicit bias showing up in your sector of work? As I sort of alluded to, I worked in legal previously, and there was, a lot of information in the news and, in advocacy movements around bias and racism and police arrest decisions and prosecutorial charges, sentencing. Suspensions, that's another big one. Someone also raised.
Yeah, Jennifer shared that many people think that people with mental health diagnoses are violent. That is actually one of the IAT tests that you can take. There's one on mental health. But yeah, we did notice that a lot of people are coming into this webinar from different sectors. So interested to see what you've experienced or what you're seeing in these various sectors as well.
Thank you for sharing. Lots of school discipline and segregation in the workplace. So this chart shows a little bit about how bias comes into play, really in any client-facing services, but we're using the mental health lens. Is that sort of the viewpoint of our center? Really, implicit bias impacts our perceptions of people, places, and events, and that can then impact our work by the way that we communicate with clients or don't communicate with clients, and the kind of decisions that we make, which can then impact client outcomes. So examples including like how you decide what kind of treatment you decide for clients, or how you view different clients' abilities based on your own biases. And if you are interested in implicit bias and how that interacts with work we do with clients, our next webinar, which is on June 30th, is focused on implicit bias and working with clients. Microaggressions in healthcare settings. So this list was made through a study of clients in healthcare settings. And as you can see here, this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but a number of the microaggressions that were noted by these individuals are similar to what many populations experience in their everyday life.
Yeah, and we'll dig into these a little bit more too as we talk about kind of how implicit bias shows up in our organizations too, because this gets to some of the things around like how do we ask questions about patients' identity, what do our forms look like, how do we do intake processes, and so these are some of those things that we want to explore further in both the client-provider session as well as in the organizational climate and culture section. But thank you also for sharing information in the chat, just kind of looking at that more around what are some of the things or assumptions that people are making. And sexism is huge in healthcare, yeah. All right, so let's spend some time talking about some strategies for identifying implicit bias and how it might be showing up also in terms of microaggressions. And we welcome your thoughts too. Like, we know we come into this work with humility and know that all of us come in with different experiences and opportunities to think about how we choose to be differently. So as I'm going through these, we welcome putting in your ideas as well in here. So here's some, and again, we're starting with the individuals. I just want to make sure that we're laying that groundwork, that this is, most of this is going to be individual work here. And so some suggestions that you might explore is looking into some of that opportunity to have some more intergroup contact, meeting with individuals from members of other groups, getting to know people in other one-on-one settings. It can seem like a really obvious and simple thing to do, but I think it can be harder than you think, because we have a tendency in our culture to gravitate towards the people that look like us or that are in the same educational realm as us or in our same work zone. And so it's really hard sometimes to get that exposure to people who are different from us. And so it does take time and effort to do. Some of the things we've seen in organizations are the starting book clubs as a way to raise awareness or to learn first. So we often talk about a book called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down in the health system as a way to learn about the experience of a Hmong person in the healthcare system. So you might do that, this engagement through engagement with people or with books or movies. The second one is around countering our stereotypes. I think that taking that implicit association test is super helpful. It kind of can help you expose to yourself where maybe some of your biases lay, and then think about like how do you move into that system to kind of part of your brain to counter some of the stereotypes that might exist for you. And recognize too that these biases happen because of what we've learned from generations and the messages we get in media. And so like how do we start to counter that? I think really being deliberate in terms of how you process is super important. I know that, that I've had experiences where I had to take a step back and pause rather than thinking about what my split-second reaction is to an event or to what somebody says to me. So we tend to respond quickly when we've got a lot of information coming at us because that's what our brain does. And so kind of, I just always think of that like, take a deep breath, count to 10, like remember to do that for yourself. Around finding common ground, and I think that the video that we showed at the beginning is such an important illustration of that for you, is that like where can you find commonalities and connections with people who look different from you or who are from different places. And so, we don't want to get into this idea of like, I'm colorblind or I don't see color. Well, that just is not like helpful or realistic and is in fact kind of a microaggression. But how do you like step into recognizing differences? How as providers can we ask about, do you have a history of racial trauma in your experience, and recognizing that that is an important consideration for many of the clients that we work with. So really kind of validating experiences of other people, kind of incorporating these disclosures into how we approach our work with clients. And then thank you for joining this session. I think that always finding opportunities to think about where you can learn and have training is important. And then finally to just continuously check in with yourself and your judgments and hold yourself accountable and ask other people to hold yourself accountable. As you become more aware about the implicit biases, it's an opportunity for us to make those daily efforts to challenge them. Some people call this micro-resistance, where you're making these incremental daily efforts to challenge white privilege or whatever privilege you come with, right? There's a question about why is it called a microaggression when it hurts so much, right? And I think it's mostly about the fact that there's these small acts. So it's not about what the impact is, right? It is about the act itself that might feel like minuscule or small. Like I just asked a question, but it's the way in which they're asked repeatedly, or the small behaviors that we think might be small, but the person that is feeling them, it is big. And so I like Leora's example around, it takes 1,000 paper cuts over and over and over again, and it is really challenging and hurtful to the people that experience them. Thank you for the question. We want to offer this action method too that was proposed by this group of people on how to address microaggressions. And so the asking the clarifying questions is to help to really understand intention. And I think when you come from a place of curiosity and not judgment, again, because a lot of our biases that then show up as microaggressions are so unconscious. But so if we can pull the unconscious into consciousness by asking clarifying questions or for an explanation, that is usually hopefully a non-judgmental way to approach an experience. And then you got to carefully listen, right? You need to actively listen and be open to whatever response you get. And if there is disagreement, like how do you make statements to encourage learning about what your experience might have been? So, for instance, what are you question, or no, really, where are you from question. I have learned how to respond to that in a way that isn't like, it depends on my mood, I will say, but that isn't harsh, or that doesn't feel as judgmental, but that is somewhat educational, right? I might tell the other person that I observed what was problematic about it. For Asians, a lot of it is that the assumption is that as an Asian that you can never be from the United States, or that you can't have been born here, that you're always going to be a foreigner. And so I kind of share that experience with folks when I get that question, like that maybe what you're really trying to ask me is what my ethnic background is. So there's opportunities there to do it in a way that is open. And then kind of think about how you consider other people in this. So, and what it might, how the impact might be. And sometimes it's easier to talk about what another person might experience versus if it's personal for you, right? So what do you think that someone might think about when they hear that type of comment? Or what message do you think that behavior sends to somebody else? So like kind of trying to put them in the space of the person that might experience the microaggression. I think also owning our own responses. So I think that if you hear or see or hear a statement, it's really thinking about like being able to say, well, when I hear your comment, this is how I feel. Or when I saw what you did, this is how it made me feel. So kind of just stepping into the dialogue. Again, it's hard. And I think about all the times where I wish I would have done something, but I didn't because I was so shocked. But it's these kind of, the other thing about microaggressions is they happen a lot and a lot and a lot. So you know that it will probably happen again. And so how can you prepare yourself to be responsive or to think about how you want to respond in the situation? And then next steps. And so offering to a person kind of what the appropriate action might be, right? So I'd appreciate it if maybe you might consider using a different term because that might be, that term is inconsistent with the way our organization operates, or, you know, making a statement like that about to help the person learn in this as well. So those are some ideas to think about as you're thinking about reflecting on your own implicit bias and maybe how it shows up and or how you see it in other people. And I know there were so many chats. I'm sorry I wasn't able to track, but Caitlin, is there anything that maybe we should lift up?
Yeah, there was some conversation around microaggressions and just wanted to make sure that to make the point that microaggressions can include gender, age, occupation. Somebody also talked about the birdcage analogy for microaggressions related to this and how, you know, each little bar may not feel a lot, but, you know, cumulatively they make the bird feel boxed in. And also, one last point someone made was that this seems like something that would be helpful for them with a colleague in a confidential, sort of sensitive, taking a sensitive approach to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is actually bringing us to the conclusion of the presentation part of the webinar, and we know that maybe not everyone can stay, and so we do want to ask you to please, please, please fill out our survey form. It only comes up, I think, after we end the webinar, and so it might not show up automatically on your screen. And so, Joanne, I don't know if you have the link, but if you don't mind maybe posting the link in the comments section so that people could go to that if they need to leave on the hour. But before we do that, we are going to also just highlight a few more things for you. Caitlin, am I doing this one? Oh, okay, I'm doing this one. So when we do trainings like this, we always like to ask people to share a little bit about one action that you might take as a result of this workshop. And so either you can reflect on this for yourself, but if you would like to share that with us, we would also welcome that again. And thank you for the mention. Sorry about my error in that citation. Cheryl, thank you for lifting that up, and I'll make sure that we make that correction in our slides as well. If you have an action that you think you would like to take or share with other people, feel free to share that in the chat box. And we will then also share the contact information for us as well. So I want to lift up again, as Caitlin mentioned at the beginning of our session, that this is part of a series. And so this is the rest of the titles for parts 2 through 4 and the links. Again, we will send these out to you since you will you're on our list, so we will send these out to you if you'd like to join us for that as well. Again, we do offer free trainings. If this is something that you might like to bring to your organization and dive deeper into a little bit, please do also reach out to us. We'd be happy to explore that opportunity with you as well. You tracking the chat, Caitlin?
So a lot of people responded that they are going to use this information to think about how they ask questions and how they reflect and how they act to make sure they're not unintentionally, manifesting their biases. That they want to use some of the IET or videos and trainings with the people that they work with. I also did want to acknowledge that someone indicated they were looking for some content around how as a supervisor they can work with their staff and their employees. And in our future webinars, there's going to be more of a focus on organizational culture. So if you are interested in that, then I think our July webinar in particular might be of interest to you. Lots of conversation around mindfulness.
Oh, and Saganya, thank you for typing in the book. So let's see. We have a question for Christopher. Do we have a curriculum tailored for teens and young adults? Oh. Ooh, that would be so cool. So our center actually has a particular focus on youth and young adults, especially youth of transition age. It is not a curricula or a training that we have in place currently. And if it feels like it's an important need, we'd be happy to have conversation and think about how we might offer that in our next contract year, which actually starts in August, so it's not very far away. So Christopher, if you want to reach out and have a chat about that, let's explore that opportunity. It may be around like how do we tailor the examples or the activities a little bit differently for young people, what might be more engaging potentially. And now someone's asking about a training for adolescents starting in middle school. That's awesome. Yes. Well, let's talk about that. Linda and Christopher, we got to get together. And let me send you our email address. Where is it? We have an email address somewhere on here. Here it is. It's Pacific Southwest at mhttcnetwork.org. So feel free to, sorry that's kind of generic, but it's a way for us to help triage requests, but we do respond to it. So please do send in ideas or thoughts, and please do fill out that, that survey, and that's also a good place to give us feedback on future topics that you'd like to see offered. And Linda, I agree. The younger we start, the better. And it sounds like there's some real interest in thinking about how do we offer this for young people. So thank you for sharing that interest. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We will work on our 30-minute extension format for next time. Please do reach out to us. We do want to hear from you, and if you give us suggestions on things that you'd like to see in the rest of the series, we would love to try to incorporate that into our content. So please share that share that either in your, Joanne, if you don't mind posting the GIPRA link again, just so it's a little bit, it's kind of closer to the bottom, that'd be great. But please do share that feedback with us, because we have time to incorporate suggestions and ideas as well into those 3 topic areas. So again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you in your work and your interest in this topic of implicit bias and how it's showing up for us as individuals.